Hi, this week we're going to talk about developing methods that tie with your objectives. So the agenda on this little presentation will be to define what methods are, talk about how you can develop the methods for your grant proposal, talk about some tips, and then show you some examples. A good way to look at methods is that it's a way to reach your objectives. So you're going to systematically walk funders through the strategies the organization proposes or you propose to carry out in order to accomplish those objectives that you wrote the previous week. And really what you're trying to do is answer the question, how will you or an organization actually accomplish the work? Frequently, methods are called strategies. So in some grant proposals, you'll see strategies. So how do you develop the methods section? Well, I liked what the book had when in terms of questions you can ask yourself. So what are the elements that are inflexible, such as there's a particular date of completion, there's only so many dollars available, there's only so many staff that you have, or there's amount of staff that are needed. And then so you would think about that, and that would help you kind of frame the scope of your methods. And then also, what are the activities that need to be carried out in order to meet those objectives that you wrote in the previous week? And then what are the starting and ending dates for each one of those activities? So if you have multiple objectives, you got to think about when you're going to start and end each activity within each objective or activities. You also have to think about who's going to be responsible for completing these activities. If you're the sole grantee, then it would just be you. But it could be that you have multiple staff and other partnerships and task force, and so you would have to think about who has the responsibility for completing each one of those activities that you came up with. And then you got to think about how will participants be selected. So if this happens to be a study where you're going to have research participants, then you have to talk about how those people will be selected so that bias doesn't enter into the study. And then the last one is, how is this methodology determined to be the best one to solve the problem presented? Does it build on models already in existence, or is this a different approach? If it's different, why is it different? And why did the organization select it? So there's a rationale involved in your methodology as well, in your methods section. Some tips to think about is that you want to be realistic on the time frame. While it may look appetizing to a particular funder to see that you could get so much done in a 6-month time frame or a year, if it's not realistic with the schedule you have in front of you, then do not put it in the methods section. Like, for instance, I'm working on a grant right now with the Federal Aviation Administration, and what they're asking for is impossible to do in one fiscal year. And so what we did is we went back to the grantors, we went back to FAA, and asked them if we could do this in 3 phases over 3 years, and explained to them that what they wanted was impossible to do in 1 year. So we could have just gone and just tried to put it all within a year. But what would have happened is when we got close to the end of that year, we would have only had a third of the work probably done, and then we would have gotten into a little bit of trouble with the FAA because we'd have to tell them that we need more time. So it's better to be honest up front. So what we did in our methods section is we broke it into 3 phases over 3 years, and they were happy with that. You also need to think about, when it comes to developing your methods, you need to have a timeline, especially if you have multiple objectives and or multiple methods. And while we've already mentioned it, I'll just mention it again, they need to be aligned to your objectives. You also have to identify a point person and the resources that are going to be needed. So I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Regarding the timeline, excuse me, this is kind of a nice way that the book talks about a timeline. So you take all of your methods, all of your strategies, as they're sometimes called, and you put them into a spreadsheet, and then you mark out what month these will be completed in. So this is a really good way to show the the funders how you've thought about how this is going to map out. It also allows them to have checks and balances in place, because they could always contact you and say, well, it's month 2, how are we doing on the grant? You should have, the first one and the fourth one totally completed. Is that true? Right. So what you're going to end up developing for this week would be something similar to this. With each one of your objectives, you're going to write the objective again, and then you're going to talk about the methods. And I want you to look at these methods, because if you look at each one of these written, you'll notice that it may have a timeline. It also may have a point person, and it also probably has the resources needed to complete that particular strategy or method. So for example, you look at the first one. The Swim for Life program manager will recruit a point person on staff at Cooperville who has a specific interest in the program. So right away, the first method is you identify a point person. And we also know who's going to identify the point person, the program manager. And then that point person will work in collaboration with the program manager to do the following: create a task force that has particular people on it, hold a short series of meetings that share best practices and lay out a recruitment plan, create specific recruitment materials, right? And so you would want to talk about those, maybe even more detailed than what they have here. And then you will notice that at one of the very last strategies within that second bullet is that to launch a time-specific recruitment period targeting at least 25 kids. So there's an exact number there. So when you start thinking about your methods, I want you to think about it in at least this detail, if not greater. And you're also going to include a spreadsheet timeline of when these objectives are going to be completed. So go to eLearning and check out your next assignment, and I wish you the best of luck.